hello, and buongiorno. Welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and thank you so much for your patience while I was out for a few weeks. I had the incredible opportunity to go to Italy. I had last been to Rome about 15 years ago, so it was wonderful to be able to go back. I listened to a podcast called Wine and Crime, and the two hosts of the show, plus 21 listeners, myself included, were able to go on this trip to Italy. We visited Rome and Florence, and then a small group of us went to Pompeii and the Amalfi Coast. We ate all the pasta, we drank all the wine in limoncello. It was wonderful. The weather was stunningly beautiful, and I couldn't have asked for a better trip or for better people to travel with. I already am in that post-vacation slump where all I want to do is go back right now. But one of my goals for my trip to Italy was to visit the town of Volterra in Tuscany because that's where this week's hospital is. Little did I know that Volterra is a bit tricky to get to without a car. And if you know anything about Italian drivers, they are very passionate, as one of my taxi drivers in Rome said. I did get very close. I went to the village of San Gimignano, which is a hilltop town in Tuscany with an incredible view. I probably could have spent all day there. The village is known for having the world's best gelato, so of course I had to have some. It was life-changing. Highly recommend. So after all that, I didn't make it to Volterra itself, but maybe I can go back on my next trip to Italy, whenever that will be. But I still wanted to discuss the history of the hospital because it definitely has a sordid past. More on that in a moment. So my main source for this episode will be the Manicomio di Volterra website. All other sources will be listed at the end of the episode transcript. Trigger warnings for this episode include outdated and ableist language and really bad Italian pronunciation. As a reminder, sort of on that note, I'm not an expert on these hospitals or on the history of Italy, but I will do my best to be as accurate as I can be. One of the difficulties of studying a hospital in a non-Anglophone country is that most of the primary sources are in Italian, and my Italian is limited to ordering a glass of wine or a croissant. So bear with me. But for now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Volterra Lunatic Asylum. As with all the hospitals we discuss, the history of the Volterra Lunatic Asylum started long before its construction. Some aspects of Italian history are well known. We know the stories of the Holy Roman Empire, the gladiators, the notorious fall of Rome in AD 476. What many people may not know is that Italy remained fragmented into city-states and kingdoms for over a millennium afterward. It wasn't until 1861 with the House of Savoy that Italy was unified into one kingdom. If you visit the Pantheon in Rome today, you'll find the burial spot of Vittorio Emanuele, known as the Father of the Fatherland. He was the one who unified Italy and became the first king of Italy. But before we get to the unification of the country, you must know that the lunatic asylums had been confined to their own previously independent kingdoms. A physician named Vincenzo Caierugi from Florence had been instrumental in improving lunatic asylums in and around Florence. According to his Wikipedia page, from 1785 to 1788, Dr. Caierugi was the director of the Santa Dorotea Hospital in Florence, where he outlawed chains as a means of restraint for psychiatric patients. Almost 10 years later, Caierugi would go on to publish a 3-volume work called On Insanity and Its Classification, which served as a sort of 18th century DSM. We have to remember the context during which all of this is happening. This was the Enlightenment period. So in Florence, the Grand Duke, Pietro Leopoldo, was implementing new reforms in the area. He added an institution for the rehabilitation of juvenile delinquents and abolished torture and the death penalty, which was fairly avant-garde for the period. He also directed his attention toward the mentally ill and introduced leggi sui pazzi, or laws on the insane, in 1774. These provided steps toward hospitalization for folks deemed insane. And Dr. Cagliarugi was put in charge of the psychiatric wing of the hospital designed for these folks. Many of these early asylums began showing up in central locations of their city-state until the unification of Italy in 1861. Now, if you've been listening to the show for a while, then you may have noticed that there's a sort of theme to the timing of asylums. Most of them were built around the start of a country or state's birth, when the government is trying to decide what to do with this subgroup of people who are different. Whether those are poor people, unhoused people, mentally ill people, people from other countries, or people addicted to substances, they lie on the fringe of society. And the pattern seems to be that once a government is organizing itself, it has to figure out what to do with those people. Now that Italy was a unified country, there was a call to add to and expand the existing asylums. According to Esther Stocco et al., in 1861, there were 897 hospitals, 35 mental hospitals, and 23 homes for mothers in Italy. But psychiatry didn't yet have a recognized role in the newly unified state. It was in this context, in 1888, that the Ospedale Psichiatrico di Volterra was founded. Volterra was chosen as the site for the new asylum primarily because the city didn't have a tax on bread and salt, so it would be able to feed patients and operate more economically. The first building was originally called Graf Ebing and was inaugurated, if you will, on July 7, 1896. According to the Volterra Asylum website, this building was known as the Clock Pavilion because on the roof in the southwestern corner, it had an enormous clock that could be seen from a distance away. It was located just in front of the former convent of San Girolamo. The building included over 200 beds, living rooms, a refectory, and service rooms. 30 patients were initially admitted as transfers from the San Nicolo Asylum in Siena. Now, although these new asylums were being built, there still wasn't much regulation about how they should be run or who should be admitted. According to Vincenzo Bongiorno, the last few decades of the 19th century saw shifts in the way that mental illness was viewed. There was a push to treat acute mental illness rather than, as previously had been done, to confine mentally ill people who were seen as dangerous. Mentally ill not only meant dangerous at this time, it also meant incurable. And here was a shift that started to see mental illness as treatable, just like any other physical illness. According to Vincenzo Bongiorno, quote, future psychiatric reform was thus to be inspired on a legislative level by a paradigm according to which, number one, the true purpose of the asylum was to be a place, not of simple segregation and personal custody, but of efficient treatment for the mentally ill in the acute phase, carried out in a rational and above all individual way, the same way in which common illnesses were treated in hospitals. 2. The increasing and inevitable costs sustained by provinces for maintaining the insane were to be better employed to the advantage of the patients themselves, with modern, functional, organizational reforms. And 3. The number of patients in asylums had to respect the hygienic and technical standards of the individual institutions. End quote. The primary way that this was going to happen was to separate acute cases from chronic ones. Folks who were viewed as acutely mentally ill and who could be cured were sent to the new asylums. Folks who were viewed as chronically and incurably mentally ill were retained in the old asylums attached to hospitals or moved to special homes and hospices. Anyone not belonging to either category was moved into the community to avoid overcrowding. Folks who did not meet the criteria for these snazzy new asylums included the following groups of people. 1. Idiots and imbeciles not exhibiting dangerous tendencies. And just a side note that today we would call these folks with intellectual disability or some other form of developmental disorder. 3. Elderly, weak, or infirm patients suffering from common chronic illnesses and permanently bedridden. 4. Pellegrins, who after cessation of their mental disturbance were often detained in the asylum due to risk of relapse, and who, if discharged, returned to their previous elementary habits. I had to look up what a pellegrin was. Pellagra, whatever, is caused by having too little niacin or tryptophan in the diet, which can be caused by gastrointestinal disease, eating disorders, or excessive alcohol use. I assume in this case it was intended for folks struggling with a drinking problem. 5. Alcoholics, perfectly normal if kept away from alcohol, but who easily relapse after the slightest abuse. And 6. Epileptics without other pathological manifestations except for convulsions. So again, these groups I just listed would not qualify for the new asylums. Instead, they were placed in a number of different locations, whether in the original psychiatric sections of the medical hospital or charitable institutions. Or sometimes, they were simply discharged to the streets, where they'd hope for the best. Even with these restrictions in mind, the population of the Volterra Lunatic Asylum only increased. By 1900, there were already 282 patients in a building intended for 200. It was clear that more patients meant more staff, and more staff meant increased need for training. By 1903, A. Tamburini had initiated the first professional course for training nursing staff, and it was taught with the help of nurses from the Reggio Emilia Asylum in northern Italy. After the turn of the 20th century, it was apparent that more regulations on these asylums were required. But first, just to back up for a moment, it's hard to capture everything that was happening all at once in Italy at this time. So I want to put it in a historical context. By the end of the 1800s, there had been two prime ministers in Italy who were increasingly authoritarian and extremist. Francesco Crispi was the prime minister from 1887 to 1891, and again from 1893 to 1896. And I just want to read this excerpt from Wikipedia about what his regime was like, because it certainly affected people at all levels of society. Quote, historian R.J.B. Boworth says of his foreign policy that Crispi pursued policies whose openly aggressive character would not be equaled until the days of the fascist regime. His policies were ruinous, both for Italy's trade with France and, more humiliatingly, for colonial ambitions in East Africa. Crispi's major concerns during the 1887 to 1891 run was protecting Italy from Austria-Hungary. Crispi worked to build Italy as a great world power through increased military expenditures, advocacy of expansionism, and trying to win Germany's favor even by joining the Triple Alliance. While helping Italy develop strategically, he continued trasformismo, which, side note, meant choosing non-partisan cabinet members. And he was authoritarian, once suggesting the use of martial law to ban opposition parties, end quote. What happened as a result of these extremist policies was that there was significant civil unrest. And all of these things are intricately interconnected. The laser focus on foreign policy affected other areas, including agriculture, which relied on outside help. And with agriculture affected, people, but especially poor people, ran out of food. And with meager food supplies, disease spread rapidly, eventually spiraling out of control into a cholera epidemic that killed at least 55,000 people. The southern part of Italy and Sicily were particularly affected by these impoverished conditions. Poverty and famine led to many people emigrating from Italy to other countries, like the United States. In fact, over 100,000 Italians immigrated to the U.S. each year, starting in 1880. So, what does all this have to do with the lunatic asylum, you ask? Well, there was a great deal of social unrest during this time, clearly, since so many people were leaving Italy as a result. Those who had to stay behind for whatever reasons were certainly impacted psychologically. Increased distress and decreased resources led to more hospitalizations. Remember, the groups that were typically hospitalized included folks with depression or melancholia, as well as people living in poverty. This, no doubt, had a corresponding effect on the increase of admissions to Volterra at the end of the 1800s. All of this was the situation that faced Dr. Luigi Scabia. And side note, I wasn't able to find if it was Scabia or Scabia, so I'm just going to go with Scabia, when he became the director of Volterra Lunatic Asylum in 1900. And another side note, this guy looks like a Luigi. He's got the curled up mustache, small circular glasses, the works. The pictures are in black and white, but I'm pretty sure he's wearing a green shirt with overalls. Anyway, during his medical training, Luigi Scabia had been interested in anthropology, criminology, biology, and psychology, which led him to practice psychiatry from a holistic perspective. And as a result, like I implied earlier, Dr. Scabia also believed that poverty was one of the main reasons for increased hospitalizations. He was a well-respected academic and physician by the time he arrived in Volterra. His goal was to positively transform the asylum into a place of treatment. Dr. Scabia believed in the power of what he called ergotherapy, which was a therapeutic approach based on physical and creative activity. He believed that work was a powerful treatment for patients. One of the ways that he put patients to work was in building the new pavilions he had planned for the expansion of the asylum. He envisioned the asylum as a sort of village. So, in the first decade of his tenure, Dr. Scabia had at least 3 buildings constructed. First was the Verga Pavilion, built in 1908. It was named after doctor and politician Andrea Verga and represented the newest, latest, and greatest in psychiatric hospital construction. It was intended as the calm patient ward. On the ground floor were living and dining rooms. On the first and second floors were dormitories, infirmary, sinks, and toilets. Next was the Villa Falconcini, which was later renamed the Kraepelin Pavilion, named after Dr. Emil Kraepelin, who coined the term dementia praecox. The Kraepelin Pavilion was 2 stories high, with spacious, well-ventilated rooms. The walls were covered with enameled materials, and there were bathrooms with individual wash basins, showing particular attention to hygiene. In 1909, the Lambroso Pavilion was built as an observation section for newly admitted patients. The structure was divided into 2 floors, each with its own external entrance, to allow for the separation of men and women. It was here that patients were introduced to ergotherapy. In 1912, the Koch Pavilion was completed. This building served as an infirmary ward for men and women. In particular, it was intended for folks with tuberculosis, but The Volterra website also mentions that a number of patients were isolated and treated there for trachoma, which is a bacterial eye infection caused by chlamydia trachomitis and can lead to irreversible blindness. All of this was happening during the tenure of Giovanni Giolitti as Prime Minister of Italy. Giolitti brought about extensive social progression throughout the country. In 1904, he'd established a mental health law that ordered folks with mental illnesses to the asylums when they were deemed to be a threat to themselves or others, or, and I don't know how I feel about this one, were deemed to be a public scandal? Now, what's interesting about the 1904 law is that it came later than most of the other mental health laws in Europe and was not nearly as progressive as the laws in other countries. Once patients were committed to the asylum, they engaged in different types of treatment. There was the ergotherapy mentioned earlier, which exercised patients' physical and creative abilities. Able-bodied patients who were able to work worked, and those who were able to engage in arts and crafts did so as well. A newspaper article written by Dr. Giulio Obici described an art exhibit that patients from asylums around Italy participated in. I won't read the entirety of the article because it's quite long, but I'll read excerpts that pertained most to Volterra. Quote, "From the world of madmen, the work of the insane, the asylums of the past and today. Asylums are self-sufficient. Schools, churches, theaters, and bands, the mysteries of an exhibition." By Dr. Giulio Obici. I'm writing to you shortly before leaving this hospitable city, where I attended the 11th Congress of Alienists. Rather than rush from one reception to another, from a gala evening to a trip to the sea and the rest, between one amusement and another, in the comfortable armchairs of the provincial council rooms discussing science, I would like to talk to you about what the lunatics of the various mental institutions in Italy have shown that they can do, whose works were put on display at the Freniatric exhibition opened at the Asilo Margherita. Almost all the mental institutions in the kingdom took part in the exhibition with photographs and plans, as well as scientific apparatus and productions, and with numerous samples of the various works carried out by the madmen. The products of the agricultural colony of the Macerata Asylum are beautiful, with its magnificent vegetable gardens and various species of chickens, and the apiaries that produce about 30 quintals of honey a year. And those of the industrial colony where tailors, and shoemakers, tinsmiths, blacksmiths, carpenters, manufacturers of bricks, mats, pasta, and hats work. The women are no less industrious, with stockings, sweaters, and fabrics, of which they produce over 5,000 meters a year. Noteworthy are the cement tiles and the straw hat work from the mental asylum in Florence. Interesting are the garments produced in Ferrara. Beautiful are the embroideries from the mental asylums in Ancona and Nocera Inferiore. Artistic are the alabasters worked by the lunatics of Volterra. Faced with such a variety of products, from canvases to straw braids, from woolen fabrics to soup noodles, from shoes to wood carvings, the layman to the intimate life of the asylum must necessarily convince himself that well-organized asylums are not that sad prison where only blasphemies and cries of anger and groans of pain resound, and in which the poor locked up wander around the cell in a disorderly and dirty way like wild beasts in a menagerie, or they move in vain as if tortured in the tight bonds of a straitjacket or restraint bands. Gone, at least to a large extent, are the crazy fears and strange prejudices that made the poor madman a being possessed by evil spirits and completely unsuitable for even the simplest form of social life. The cruel and iron treatment of past centuries has been replaced by compassionate, enlightened, and serene therapy. And if, unfortunately, it cannot always obtain the healing of the patient, it tends in every way to delay the complete psychic collapse of the patient, to defend piece by piece his moral, intellectual, and volitional personality, to reunite and persevere through exercise and re-education the last few healthy elements that may have survived the fierce storms of the spirit. End quote. It goes on from there to be equally flowery and painful to read, but I think you get the point. And this feels like a wee bit of an over-romanticized view of the asylums and their patients. Remember that this doctor who is writing just went to an art exhibit at a psychiatry convention, and he's making all sorts of assumptions about how serene and wonderful each asylum is. And that's pretty dangerous territory. Just because someone makes a whole bunch of socks in alabaster does not mean that they're living their best life. But it does mean they've been able to be productive. One of the other treatments that Dr. Scabia recommended for his patients at Volterra was called the Preinitz wrap therapy. The name of this was new to me, but the concept isn't. It had been used since the beginning of the Volterra Lunatic Asylum in 1888 and would continue to be used at least until 1910, if not later. The treatment was invented by physician Wilhelm Preinitz and involved cold or warm compresses applied to the patient in order to treat a number of illnesses. But instead of what we might do today by applying a heat or ice pack to a sore area, the entire patient was wrapped in either warm or cold compresses like a mummy. I think I've referred to this in previous episodes as patients being wrapped up in ice-cold sheets. It's the same concept. The intent was to calm the nervous system by reducing agitation or symptoms of mania and promote relaxation. In other cases, it would be used to reduce fever or pain. According to the Volterra website, Luigi Scabia wrote extensively of this treatment in his records. He said it was used on a large scale, especially for cases of severe agitation, because it was a less invasive and more humane technique than other mechanical restraints. It was used not only in lieu of medications, but also as a method of restraint. Fortunately, it required personnel who had been trained in using the technique, and patients were allegedly monitored by medical staff to prevent hypothermia or skin infections. And of course, I wonder how successful this monitoring was. Surely they couldn't have had someone with them all the time. They were chronically understaffed, but who knows? I should also add, and I think I mentioned this in previous episodes, that this concept is still used today. Dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, sometimes uses the technique of ice diving for folks struggling with anger or other heightened emotions. And there are a couple of ways to do this. One is by simply dunking your face into a bowl of ice water for anywhere from several seconds up to about 30 seconds. Other approaches are to take a cold compress or whatever you have on hand, a frozen bag of peas, and hold it up to your face. This cools down the nervous system without causing damage, as the Preinitz wrap therapy likely caused back in the day. Now, I'm going to pause the history of the Volterra Lunatic Asylum here before the outbreak of World War I, because there's a lot of history that happens in Italy and in the hospital during this time. But I wanted to end the episode with a couple of patient stories from the Volterra Lunatic Asylum website. The first is the story of Vladimir Lvovich Shereshevsky, also known as Vladimir or Vladimiro Shereshevsky, who was a painter born on September 25th, 1863, in Brest-Litovsk, a rich a city rich in history and culture in the Russian Empire. His parents, Lev Shereshevsky and Anna Abramovich, passed on to him his cultural heritage. After completing his studies in mathematics in Warsaw and Moscow, Shereshevsky decided to follow his true passion, art. In 1892, he moved to Munich, where he began to study painting and actively participated in international exhibitions. Shereshevsky's life took a significant turn when he fell in love with and married Elizabeth von Herf, born in Worms on June 23, 1859. Their union produced two daughters, Elfrida and Aglaia. In 1895, Shereshevsky visited Venice for the first time at the invitation of Antonio Fradaletto, then Secretary General of the Venice International Art Exhibition. The artist was enchanted by the lagoon city and decided to settle there with his family. The official registration of his residence in Venice dates back to May 1st, 1895. In Venice, Shereshevsky lives first at Dorso Duro 2765, near the parish of San Barnaba, and later at Palazzo Bruzza, which today houses one of the seats of Ca' Foscari University. His influence on the Venetian art scene was notable, especially through his private lessons, which had a significant impact on one of the future great artists of the modern Venetian season, Gino Rossi. Shereshevsky participated in 4 editions of the Venice International Art Exhibition between the 19th and 20th centuries. At the second exhibition in 1897, he presented 2 monumental works, A Stage of Deportees in Siberia and A Patriotic Song. These works captured the attention of the public and critics, arousing admiration for their deep emotionality and realism. However, his artistic career underwent a drastic change due to a tragic experience. After an arrest and 10 days of unjust detention in an Austrian prison on the Dalmatian coast, Shereshevsky developed mental problems that led to an obsessive mania for a non-existent painting called The Last Supper. This obsession tormented him for many years and contributed to his mental deterioration. In 1907, Shereshevsky was captured and committed to a mental asylum on the island of Sanservolo. He was subsequently transferred to various psychiatric clinics in Italy, including Stra, Como, and finally Volterra. Here, at the age of 79, the painter of pain and contradictions died, probably in the famous mental asylum of Volterra. Despite the mental difficulties that afflicted Shereshevsky, his artistic talent remained undisputed. Evidence of his original pictorial production is preserved in private Italian collections and at the Quirinale, where his painting The Pessimist was purchased by the Italian royal family in 1926, thanks to the mediation of Antonio Fradaletto. Vladimir Lvovich Shereshevsky left an indelible mark on the art scene of Venice and remains an example of how artistic genius can be challenged by personal and psychological tragedies. His story is a testimony to the eternal struggle between the creative mind and the dark forces that can threaten it. End quote. The second story of the artist turned patient is that of Raffaello Gambogi. And here's his story. Quote, Raffaello Gambogi, born in Livorno in 1874, was one of the most significant painters of the Italian artistic movement of post-Macchiaioli. His extraordinary artistic career was influenced by a series of encounters and experiences that profoundly marked his evolution as a painter. In 1892, at the age of 18, Gambogi enrolled at the Academy of Fine Arts in Florence, a crucial step in his artistic education. Here, he had the opportunity to come into contact with the Florentine artistic environment, and in particular, with the master Giovanni Fattori. However, the figure who most profoundly influenced the young artist was Angiolo Tomasi. It was under Tomasi's guidance that Gambogi created one of his most iconic paintings, The Emigrants, in 1894. This work is a clear tribute to the teaching and inspiration received from Tomasi. But the most significant influence in the life of Raffaello Gambogi was the meeting with Elin Danielsson, a talented Finnish painter who moved to Italy. In 1898, the two artists married, settling in Torre del Lago. This union marked the beginning of a very fruitful artistic collaboration between the two spouses. During his artistic career, Gambogi became part of the circle La Bohème, a cultural and Goliardic association that supported the work of Giacomo Puccini. In this context, he shared ideas and creative moments with artists such as Angelo and Ludovico Tomasi, Francesco Fanelli, Ferruccio Pagni. This period represented the pinnacle of Gambogi's art, which, under his influence and the advice of his wife Elin, he oriented his compositions toward a new balance between form and light, creating an atmosphere that could be described as Nordic for its austerity. However, as time passed, Raffaello Gambogi's life underwent a series of personal challenges. At the turn of the century, he moved to Livorno in the Antignano neighborhood, and the first signs of mental health problems began to appear. A trip to Finland brought out a mental illness that the painter may have harbored for years. In 1904, he settled in Volterra, where he sought specialized care at the local mental asylum run by the notorious Dr. Luigi Scabia. During his stay in Volterra, Gambogi painted some famous works, including the Church of San Michele, Piazza dei Priori in Volterra, and the Church of San Francesco in Volterra. Despite his personal difficulties, his artistic ability remained remarkably intact. Gambogi's life suffered a further blow when his wife Elin died of pneumonia in 1919. This event deeply affected the painter, who withdrew into himself, further accentuating his difficulties in relating to others. He spent the last years of his life in almost total isolation, which negatively affected his artistic production. Among the most famous works by Raffaello Gambogi are Ships in the Port of Livorno, 1894, The Exit from the Mass, 1896, and Portrait of the Painter Victor Westerholm, 1901. These works testify to his extraordinary ability to capture the light and atmosphere of the places he portrayed. Raffaello Gambogi, despite the personal difficulties he faced in his life, remains a significant figure in the history of Italian art, particularly known for his adherence to the principles of the post-Macchiavelli and his ability to create works that convey a sense of Nordic austerity in the warm Tuscan atmosphere. His artistic legacy lives on today through his iconic works and his contribution to 19th and 20th century Italian painting." End quote. And that's where I'll pause the story of Volterra Lunatic Asylum. Be sure to come back next week for part 2 and more stories about people who lived and worked there. Thank you again so much for your patience in waiting for this episode. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the show. Special thanks to Lacey for being the latest and greatest Patreon supporter. I really, really appreciate it. especially since, as some of you noticed, my dinosaur of a MacBook finally stopped updating, so I had to invest in a new one. And gosh darn it, wouldn't you know, these new MacBooks don't have USB ports anymore. So I wasn't able to use my microphone, but I will get that fixed for next time. Don't you worry. So, all that said, it really means a lot to me that people listen to my show and support it. I think I will add some more stories from Volterra as extra Patreon content, but I will wait until after I get my USB port so I can use my microphone. So be watching for that. If you don't follow the show on Instagram or in the Facebook group, be sure to do that. I have pictures from my Italy trip there in both places, so you can see some of the fun that was had. That really was a wonderful trip, and I wish I could just relive it over and over. I can't tell you how many times I've daydreamed about selling everything I own and running away to Italy. It sounds so good. And also, if you haven't done so already, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening, but especially if that's on Apple Podcasts. It looks like the last review on Apple Podcasts was left in April. So head on over and let others know what you think of the show. It really helps the algorithm find other people who might want to listen, and I would appreciate that so much. Again, thank you so much for listening. Please come back next week. And of course, remember the words of Maya Angelou. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.